if a sitting senator misjudges his opponent on live television. What happens in the next 10 seconds? The Senate hearing room is thick with tension. C-SPAN cameras are locked in. Pages turn. Footsteps soften. And then, silence. The kind that comes right before the opening bell. On the dais, Senator Tim Scott wears a confident smile that cuts through the room's formality. At the witness table, Representative Jasmine Crockett stands tall, burgundy blazer pressed sharp, natural twists neatly set, eyes focused and unflinching. Scott leans into the mic. His tone is measured, edged with condescension. Representative Crockett, I see you went to law school. That's nice. A beat. But did they actually teach you the Constitution? Or were you busy with other priorities? The air stalls. A few gasps from the back rows. Phones rise. Scott's smile widens by a half step, as if the punch has already landed. Crockett doesn't blink. She adjusts the mic, a small, perfectly timed gesture, and answers, voice even and cold. Senator Scott, before we continue, let me be clear. You're really questioning my law degree when you yourself have never passed the bar exam. The room breaks open. Whispers flip to open astonishment. Cameras punch in tight. Scott's smile vanishes, replaced by a look of pure shock. In that instant, the exchange stops being theater. It becomes a test. Preparation versus power. And the balance of the hearing begins to tilt. Right in front of everyone, if you want more moments like this, where knowledge and composure meet raw power. Subscribe and join our community at Jasmine Crockett File. We deliver political moments that don't just shock, they inspire. Now, let's see how this plays out. Tim Scott built a brand as the GOP's steady voice of reason, the only black Republican in the Senate. He cast himself as a bridge builder, fluent in conservative doctrine. Fluent, too, he often said. In the lived struggles of black Americans, the packaging was impeccable. Polished speeches, discipline on message, frequent Fox News hits, a rising star some whispered could be presidential. But beneath the smile and the smooth talking points was a simple fact. He's never practiced law, never tried a case, never stood at counsel table and felt a judge's stare. Political science undergrad straight into politics. No JD, no bar card, no courtroom. And yet, here he was, questioning the credentials of someone who'd done all three. That contrast is the fault line running through this hearing. On one side, performance, projection, the calculus of television politics. On the other, training, receipts, and the muscle memory of litigation. When those worlds collide under bright lights, the camera doesn't blink. It keeps score. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, was the real deal. Born and raised in St. Louis. She worked her way through Bowie State University, then pushed through law school at the University of Houston. She'd passed the bar on her first try, something Scott had never even attempted. For years, she practiced civil rights law, defending people who couldn't defend themselves, taking on cases that more established lawyers wouldn't touch. She'd been elected to the Texas House, then to Congress, carrying with her not just political ambition, but actual courtroom battle scars. She knew how to argue, how to present evidence, how to dismantle an opponent's case piece by piece. And now, standing in this Senate hearing room, she was about to show Tim Scott exactly what a real lawyer could do. This hearing wasn't just another routine political theater. It was about voting rights legislation that could reshape American democracy. Scott and his Republican colleagues were trying to block a bill that would expand access to the ballot box. Early voting. Automatic registration protections against voter suppression tactics that had plagued black and brown communities for generations. Crockett had been invited to testify as an expert witness, bringing not just her political position, but her legal expertise and lived experience. The Republicans knew she was dangerous, articulate, prepared, and unafraid. That's why Scott had decided to try to humiliate her early to knock her off balance before she could present her testimony. But he'd made a critical miscalculation. He thought she was just another politician. He didn't realize she was a trained attorney who knew how to turn a hostile cross-examination into a devastating counterattack. The clip of Scott's initial jab had already started circulating on social media. Conservative accounts were celebrating it as another example of Scott destroying a Democrat. But they had no idea what was about to come next. The real battle hadn't even begun. Scott tried to recover quickly. He sat up straighter, his smile returning, but lacking its earlier confidence. "Representative Crockett," he said, his voice now carrying a slight edge. "I think you're deflecting from the actual issue here." "Am I deflecting?" Crockett cut him off smoothly, her voice rising just enough to command the room. "Or am I simply pointing out that you started this conversation by questioning my credentials when you have absolutely no standing to do so?" She pulled out a folder from her briefcase, opening it deliberately, letting the tension build. The cameras captured every movement. Other senators on the panel leaned forward, suddenly alert. This wasn't going according to script. "Let's talk about credentials," Senator Crockett continued, her voice calm but lethal. "I graduated from law school. I passed the bar exam on my first attempt. I practiced law for over a decade, specializing in civil rights cases. I've argued before state courts, federal courts, and appellate courts." She looked up from her notes, eyes boring into Scott. "What's your legal experience again?" "Senator." "Oh. That's right. You don't have any. You never went to law school. You never took the bar exam. You've never represented a single client in a court of law." The gallery erupted in murmurs. A few Democratic staffers couldn't suppress their reactions. Sharp intakes of breath, barely concealed smiles. Republican staffers scrambled on their phones, clearly trying to fact-check Crockett's claims in real time. Senator Ted Cruz, sitting next to Scott, leaned over to whisper something, but Scott waved him off, his jaw clenched. He was on his own now, and he knew it. "Representative. I don't think." Scott attempted again. "No. Senator." "Let me finish," Crockett said, her tone sharpening because this is important. "You stood here and tried to humiliate me by suggesting I don't understand the Constitution. But let me tell you what I understand." She held up a document. "This is the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I've actually litigated cases under this law. I've defended clients whose voting rights were stripped away by the exact kind of legislation you're supporting today. I've stood in courtrooms and argued constitutional law while you were giving speeches at fundraisers." The room had gone from tense to electric. Every person present knew they were witnessing something historic. This wasn't just a political exchange. It was an execution, methodical and devastating. Scott's face had progressed from red to nearly purple. He gripped his pen so tightly his knuckles turned white. "This is highly irregular," he sputtered. "What's irregular," Crockett shot back, "is a senator who's never practiced law trying to lecture an actual attorney about legal credentials. What's irregular is you sitting there in judgment of my education when you wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real courtroom." Democratic Senator Raphael Warro, trying to hide a smile, leaned into his microphone. "I think the representative has made her point clear. Senator Scott, perhaps we should move on to the actual testimony." But Crockett wasn't finished. "Actually, Senator Warro, I'd like to finish answering Senator Scott's question about my education because I think it's important that the American people understand exactly who's qualified to speak on these issues and who's just playing politics." She turned back to Scott, her voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Senator, you asked if they taught me about the Constitution in law school. The answer is yes. They taught me all 3 articles. They taught me about the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. They taught me about the 15th Amendment's protection of voting rights. They taught me how to read Supreme Court precedent, how to analyze statutory language, how to construct a legal argument." She paused, letting each word land like a hammer blow. "And most importantly, they taught me how to recognize when someone is completely out of their depth. Which, Senator, is exactly where you are right now." The gallery exploded. This time, the chair couldn't even call for order over the chaos. Twitter erupted simultaneously, with the exchange being clipped and shared thousands of times per minute. Number Jasmine Crockett and number Tim Scott both rocketed to the top of trending topics, with the clear consensus being that Scott had just been absolutely destroyed. Scott sat frozen, clearly trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. His political instincts, usually so sharp, had completely failed him. He'd walked into a trap of his own making, underestimating his opponent and overestimating his own position. The committee chairman, sensing the complete collapse of decorum, tried to intervene. "I think we should take a brief recess." "No," Crockett said firmly. "I came here to provide testimony on voting rights legislation, and I'm going to do exactly that, unless Senator Scott has any other questions about my credentials." She looked directly at Scott, her expression challenging. The entire room held its breath. Scott opened his mouth, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in his political career, Tim Scott had absolutely nothing to say. "That's what I thought," Crockett said quietly, but the microphone picked it up perfectly. The room erupted again, this time with actual applause from some corners of the gallery, something almost never heard in Senate hearings. She then proceeded to deliver her prepared testimony with devastating precision. Every point was backed by legal precedent. Every argument was supported by constitutional analysis. Every claim was reinforced with real-world examples from her years of legal practice. It was a masterclass in legal argumentation, made even more powerful by the contrast with Scott's earlier attempt to demean her credentials. "The proposed legislation you're considering today would effectively nullify decades of progress in voting rights," she stated, her voice strong and clear. "It would disproportionately impact Black and brown communities, just as similar legislation has done throughout American history. And I don't say this as a politician. I say this as an attorney who has seen firsthand the devastating impact of voter suppression." She detailed specific cases she'd worked on. Elderly Black voters turned away from polls, communities where polling places were shut down with no notice, registration purges that mysteriously affected certain neighborhoods more than others. Each example was presented with the precision of a closing argument, each fact laid out systematically. Scott, still visibly shaken, tried one more time to interject with a question, but his voice lacked any of its earlier confidence. "Representative, don't you think you're being somewhat dramatic?" Dramatic Crockett's eyes flashed. "Senator, I represented a 73-year-old woman who'd voted in every election since 1965. In 2018, she was told her registration was invalid because of a signature mismatch, a signature she'd made with arthritic hands. That's not dramatic. That's reality. And it's the reality you're trying to expand with this legislation." Scott had no response. None of the Republican senators did. They'd expected an easy political win, a chance to score points against a freshman congresswoman. Instead, they'd unleashed a legal mind that was running circles around them as Crockett concluded her testimony. The energy in the room had completely shifted. The Republican senators, who'd been lounging confidently at the start, now sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact. Democratic senators were barely containing their satisfaction, some taking notes, as if to capture every moment of what had just transpired. Scott's usual post-hearing routine of talking to reporters was notably absent. He gathered his papers quickly and left through a side exit, dodging the press corps that was desperate for his reaction. His staffers scrambled to provide damage control, issuing vague statements about productive dialogue that fooled absolutely no one. Meanwhile, Crockett stood at the witness table, calmly packing her briefcase as reporters swarmed. She answered their questions with the same precision she'd displayed during the hearing, never gloating, never showboating, just presenting facts. Senator Scott started this exchange by questioning my credentials. She told one reporter, "I simply responded with facts," if he felt embarrassed. Perhaps he should reconsider his approach to serious policy discussions. It was the perfect response, measured, professional, and absolutely devastating. Within minutes of the exchange, social media had erupted into absolute chaos. The video clip of Crockett's "You couldn't even pass the bar exam yourself" line went viral instantly, racking up millions of views across Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. The hashtag number Jasmine Crockett trended at #1 worldwide, with number Tim Scott following close behind. Though the tweets under Scott's hashtag were decidedly less flattering. Memes flooded the internet, Scott's face photoshopped onto boxing ring defeats, game over screens, and courtroom disasters. One particularly viral tweet read, "Tim Scott tried to question a civil rights attorney's credentials and got absolutely destroyed." This is what happens when you bring a political science degree to a law fight. Number Jasmine Crockett. Number law school matters. Legal Twitter. Always a brutal crowd was particularly merciless. Verified accounts from law professors, practicing attorneys, and legal analysts all weighed in, most celebrating Crockett's performance as a textbook example of how to handle a hostile adversary. As someone who teaches trial advocacy, I'm showing this clip to my students. One Yale law professor tweeted, "This is how you respond to bad faith attacks with precision, facts, and complete command of your expertise." Conservative outlets tried to spin the exchange, with some claiming Scott was ambushed or that Crockett was disrespectful. But even many conservative commentators privately admitted that Scott had made a serious mistake. One Fox News contributor tweeted, then quickly deleted, "Sometimes you just need to know when you're outmatched." Scott should have seen this coming. Major news outlets couldn't ignore the story. CNN, MSNBC, and even some conservative networks ran segments analyzing the exchange. Legal analysts were brought in to break down exactly why Crockett's response was so effective. This wasn't just a political clapback, noted one MSNBC legal analyst. This was a trained attorney using courtroom skills in a political arena. She didn't just defend herself, she completely dismantled his credibility to even ask the question. The Washington Post ran a detailed piece titled, "When Legal Expertise Meets Political Theater: How Jasmine Crockett Turned the Tables on Tim Scott." The article detailed Crockett's background, her legal career, and the growing trend of attorneys entering politics with the skills to match their opponents. The New York Times focused on the broader implications. Scott's stumble highlights Republican vulnerability on voting rights. The piece argued that the exchange revealed how unprepared Republicans were to defend their voting legislation against substantive legal challenges. Even The Atlantic weighed in with a long-form analysis. The new generation of black women politicians unafraid and unmatched. The article positioned Crockett alongside other rising stars like Stacey Abrams and Ayanna Pressley, arguing that this new generation combined legal expertise, lived experience, and political savvy in ways that traditional politicians couldn't match. The fallout from the exchange extended far beyond social media reactions and news coverage, politically. It marked a significant shift in the dynamics around voting rights legislation. For Tim Scott, the damage was immediate and severe. His carefully cultivated image as a thoughtful conservative voice was shattered. Donors started asking questions. Fellow Republicans quietly distanced themselves. His presidential ambitions, which had been quietly building, took a massive hit. This is what happens when you underestimate your opponent. One Republican strategist told Politico on Background, Scott thought he could score easy points. Instead, he made himself look foolish and gave Democrats their best moment in months. For Jasmine Crockett, the moment wasn't just a viral clip, it was a hinge. Money began to move first. Small dollar donations stacking up hour by hour, followed by larger checks that signal institutional attention. Progressive groups that had been lukewarm sent invitations. National Democratic leadership put her on the calendar. Within weeks, Crockett was in strategy rooms, not as a guest star, but as a principal, helping shape both the legal spine and the public message of voting rights proposals. The shift was bigger than one politician's profile. The exchange reframed the conversation. For months, Republicans had driven the narrative under the banner of election security, emphasizing process and suspicion. After this hearing, Democrats could point to a living rebuttal, a civil rights lawyer who had tried real cases, argued real law, and could translate courtroom consequences into plain language. Crockett's testimony gave the debate something politics too often lacks: receipts. Legal academics noticed. So did practitioners, on op-ed pages and in faculty lounges. There was a common refrain. This is what happens when litigation discipline walks into a hearing room. Not slogans, not vibes, tactics, precedent, the cadence of cross-examination, the exchange. They argued, was less about owning an opponent and more about what it looks like when expertise refuses to be intimidated. There was a cultural layer, too, one that can't be measured purely by votes or headlines. For Black women in politics, who are routinely told to soften their tone, to prove their credentials twice, to apologize for occupying space. The moment resonated. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't grandstand. She deployed facts with surgical precision, then proceeded to do the harder work, laying out a statutory case, step by step, in language the public could follow. If you were looking for a blueprint, it didn't live in the clapback. It lived in the method. Meanwhile, Tim Scott tried to steady the ship. He went on television to recast the exchange as a spirited policy debate. But the follow-ups were clinical. Why question her credentials? Why start there? The pauses between his sentences told their own story. His staff pushed out statements about productive dialogue, but each new release ran into the same brick wall, a highlight reel that needed no narrator. Allies floated the idea of a formal debate to set the record straight. The trial balloon didn't get far. Those who've spent time in court know a simple truth. Preparation exposes performance, and Crockett had prepared her case. On paper and in muscle memory. The smarter play for Scott's team was to move on. They tried. The internet did not. So what does it mean beyond the week's news cycle? Start with Crockett. The possibilities expand. A committee gavel someday. A statewide run. Roles that require both message discipline and legal fluency. None of that is guaranteed. Politics punishes certainty, but she proved something few in Congress can readily show. She can take a punch, absorb it, and turn it into structure. It's not just charisma, it's craft. For Scott, the road narrows, not fatally, but noticeably. Presidential talk dims when your most circulated clip features stunned silence. His credibility on legal and constitutional matters will carry an asterisk in future confrontations. Because opponents now have an easy exhibit. The day performance met preparation and blinked. There's a broader lesson for the political class, and it cuts in both directions. First, never underestimate your opponent. Scott's initial calculation, that a credential jab would land, wasn't just unkind, it was strategically unsound. Second, preparation beats personality. You can train a candidate to hit beats and smile on cue. You cannot fake the repetitions of real litigation, or the clarity that comes from having a judge cut you off mid-sentence and demand the rule. Third, facts still matter. In a media ecosystem optimized for reaction, Crockett's advantage wasn't volume, it was verification. She cited law, she cited cases, she tied doctrine to human stakes. Fourth, know when you're outmatched. Losing a moment is survivable. Extending it is how you turn a bruise into a narrative. Months from now, when the voting rights fight resurfaces, what will endure from this day is not the gasp in the gallery, but the architecture of the argument. Law schools will use the clip for a different reason than cable shows do, as a case study in how expert testimony should be delivered under hostile questioning. Political science classes will file it under a more prosaic heading. Don't pick the fight your opponent trains for, and the hearing itself. What of its immediate object? The bill remains alive, contested on the usual fronts: access, integrity, administration. But the debate now carries different references. Lawmakers cite Crockett's examples when they discuss signature mismatches or precinct closures. Staff memos link to case summaries instead of talking points. You can dislike the substance and still acknowledge the pivot. A conversation recentered on evidence. It's worth pausing on the gendered and racial dimension without reducing the moment to symbolism. The history here is long and often ugly. Doubts about temperament, about fit, about whether authority can be exercised without an apology attached. Crockett's refusal to play to those expectations was not defiance for its own sake. It was professional posture. She met a status challenge with a standards answer. Credentials. Here are mine. Law. Here is the statute. Constitution. Here are the amendments and the cases. And then, crucially, she returned to the purpose of the hearing. That last part is what separates a viral clip from a lesson plan. As for the media ecosystem, it behaved exactly as designed. The punchy line traveled faster than the testimony, because it's built to. But the longer cut found an audience. 2. Lawyers, organizers, local officials who live with the mechanical parts of elections. That second wave is where policy lives or dies. The spectacle opens the door. The specifics walk through it. If you're looking for a single sentence to hold on to, it might be this: expertise is power, not the loud kind, the durable kind. The kind that turns lights and microphones and 4-minute allotments into a chance to move something that felt immovable. None of this canonizes anyone. Crockett will have off days. Scott will have strong ones. The next hearing will test different muscles. But the template is there, available to any public servant willing to trade performance for preparation. Master the record. Assume the cameras are honest witnesses. And speak as if the people watching can tell the difference between a show and a showing. Back in that room, the sound you remember is the collective intake of breath. But the part that mattered happened in the exhale, when the law came out, when the examples lined up, when a hearing did what hearings are supposed to do: clarify the stakes. The aftershocks will continue. Fundraising numbers, bookers' calls, whispers about what's next. Strip all that away, and you're left with a scene simple enough to fit in a civics textbook. A senator tried to diminish a witness's standing. The witness established it. The conversation moved from status to substance. That is not just good television. That is how a republic is supposed to argue with itself. And if you are a young person watching, especially a young woman of color, you saw more than a confrontation. You saw a method. Prepare until the facts become muscle memory. Hold your ground without raising your voice, and insist that the room return to the point. It's not glamorous. It's not always rewarded immediately. But it works, because reality eventually outruns rhetoric. Tim Scott walked into that hearing expecting to score points. He walked out having learned the cost of misreading the room, and the opponent across from him, Jasmine Crockett, didn't celebrate. She packed her briefcase and answered questions. Then she left behind something harder to spin, a record. Share your thoughts below. I'm listening and I want to hear from this community. If you're finding value here, like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss the next story. And before you go, check out the featured video on your screen. It's a piece I'm especially proud of. Thank you for your support, and I'll see you next time.